My name is Gina Kennedy. I work for Bioversity International, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session today on exploring business, policy, and science connections, linking multifunctional landscapes and seascapes to food, nutrition, and the environment. So this is a theme that CGR centers, including Bioversity International, CIAT, and C4, have been working on together with the Stockholm Resilience Center, as well as the EAT initiative. So this event also has been sponsored by Swede Bio. We thank them for that. So it's really with great pleasure that I introduce our moderator for the session, Julia Martin-Lefebvre. Julia is a member of the Board of Trustees of Bioversity International. She was Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature until earlier this year. While Julia was at the helm of the IUCN, the concept of nature-based solutions to global challenges was adopted by the organization's 1,300 members. And it's very relevant to this conversation that we'll have today, as well as to the ongoing discussions on climate. Julia also is now serving on several academic, private sector, and international boards, and she will spend 2016 as a visiting fellow at Yale University. So it's with great pleasure that I hand the floor over to our moderator, Julia.
Thank you very much. Merci. Bon appétit. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch, but I'm sure we can do many things. We're good at multitasking. So I want to start out by making sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean by this term multifunctional land and seascapes. And if after I've tried to explain it, you still don't understand, or if you have an idea for something simpler, tell us later. But I just want to, let's be very realistic. We are 7.5 billion inhabitants of this small planet, which is our only home. I don't know if any of you know of a plan B or a planet B, but right now we don't have one. And we are going toward 10 billion. So each of our fellow inhabitants on this planet has the right for a healthy life, as agreed by the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which were accepted by all the nations of the world just a few months ago. So this planet, our planet is finite, and therefore we need to be very, very clever in the way we manage its land and seascapes. And that's what this is about, so that we can provide each of us with the support, so that the planet can provide each of us with the support we will need to live a dignified lifestyle and to reach those 17 goals. So although there are 17 of these SDGs, some people feel that perhaps they're not related enough, but in fact, the absolute aim of the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of us have been working on them for many years, is that they should be closely linked to each other, and that the goals will drive across all parts of society, not only governments, the ones that are negotiating, having their day off today, but in Le Bourget, but really everyone. And I want to say that although there's one specific goal about ending hunger, 7 of the 17 goals are directly linked to this conversation. So that's already a demonstration of the interlinkages. So therefore, what are we trying to do? The sound management of food production systems is fundamental for both environmental sustainability, we're talking about that, nutrition and health, and thus central to all of the goals. So this is the spirit in which we have organized this particular session to demonstrate these interlinkages, these connections between business, policy, and the science sectors to find the right solutions. And I'm glad that Gina, when she introduced me, I cut down my long CV to the solutions is really extremely important. In my last job, the solutions offered by nature, I think that has now been accepted. So our panelists, I've asked them to give us their viewpoints on how well-managed multifunctional land or seascapes can support the planet, and how we can collaborate across each sector to achieve the mutual objectives. Mutual is key here, of environmental sustainability, nutrition, and health, and not just for those of us who just got a little lunch here, but for everyone on the planet. So I think it's very important for you to know that the TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study, is launching a very important TEEB for Agriculture study, which will be launched later on this afternoon. And Patrick, I hope you'll say a few words about it. I know there are some other TEEB people in the room, and I'm still on the TEEB advisory board. So the big question for all of us is how we can meet food and nutrition security for all of us while not undermining the life support capacities of nature. So our intention in this session is to inform on the issues, exchange information, give us ideas, connect the different sectors that should be involved. We're still way too much in a siloed society, and to encourage action toward a vision of healthy people and healthy planet. So let me just quickly introduce my panelists. I could say that I could spend 2 hours on each of you, and I'm not going to do it. I think you know most of them, so forgive me. I'm going to be very brief. Johan Rockström is Executive Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. He's also professor in environmental science with emphasis on water resources and global sustainability at Stockholm University, and the leader of the Planetary Boundaries Framework for Human Development. He will also be able to tell us about the EAT initiative. Sarah Scher is founding president and CEO of Eco Agriculture Partners. Sarah is also chair of Landscapes for People, Food and Nature, this initiative, and among other memberships, she serves on the UN Agri-Food Task Force. You can see why we invited these good people. And Patrick Holden is founding chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust. He was also founding chairman of the British Organic Farmers and has been a regular advocate for a major global transition to a more sustainable food system. And Patrick is on the steering committee of the TEEB for Ag. Now, unfortunately, a fourth panelist, Gladys Mugambi, who is head of nutrition and dietetics unit of the Ministry of Health in Kenya, had another issue in Kenya and isn't able to be with us. She was going to be the policy person, but I happen to know that each of us on this panel, and many of you who I know here, know about influencing policy, so help us with that. Okay, so I will begin by asking each of you to give us a very brief, 3 minutes if possible, view of your experience in working across sectors, that's the focus of this session, to improve the planet's ability to provide food for a better quality diet based on well-managed land and seascapes. And in asking my questions to each of you, I hope you will illustrate your answers by telling us what works, what doesn't work, and why. We've been with too many people who only talk about success. There are still challenges to overcome. I know we can do it. Johan, let me start with you.
Thank you so much, Julia, and wonderful to be here. Now, let me just start by as an entry point to the discussion of multi-stakeholder collaboration, just remind of something which we're all aware of, and I think that is coming through this introduction, that we're standing in a completely new juncture when it comes to the future of agriculture on this planet. In fact, one can state scientifically, as dramatic as following, that the final battleground, whether we'll be able to transition to a future staying below 2 degrees Celsius warming, is no longer isolated in the reduction of emissions from burning of fossil fuels, but it's really whether or not we'll be able to sustainably manage the ecosystems in our biosphere. And this is because of the carbon sinks and the resilience and the fundamental ecological functions and services that are provided in landscapes and seascapes, which regulate the resilience of the entire planet. So clearly, agriculture is the #1 culprit and also potentially #1 solution in that transition. And that takes me then directly then to the stakeholder interaction. My personal experience here is actually one of frustration that despite the fact that we have a rising interest of stakeholder interaction between scientists, business leaders, policymakers, civil society, farmers, there is a disconnect in terms of the in-depth understanding of where the science is standing. So even though science is very clear that we need basically investments in sustainable intensification to have a chance to feed a rising population of 9-10 billion people, everyone with a right to development and diets, and that this is quite well articulated. We have it even fed with quite a lot of empirical evidence of how you can achieve, and we have great people here with Sarah and Patrick with a lot of empirical evidence on how you can actually combine sustainable agricultural investments with productivity enhancements and improved livelihoods. This is not being understood truly by funders or policymakers, not even from those who lead our large consultative group on international agricultural research, which still works basically on business as usual, not really seeing that, you know, we've adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. The world has agreed that the only pathway to succeed in prosperity for 9-10 billion people is a global transformation to a completely new logic for agriculture. And still we're kind of operating more or less on an incremental idea that we have productivity first and some environmental challenges second. So I think there's a bit of a mismatch in how you get stakeholders to truly align around the same vision and around the same strategy so that we can make the right type of investments. That in fact even reflects, I would argue, still among policymakers who remarkably have stepped onto the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're not seeing that translated into the right type of recognition that the solutions really lie in major investments in new type of applied, innovative, interdisciplinary research to really get a takeoff on resilience building, on green water management, on multifunctional landscapes, on biodiversity or diversity-rich agricultural development. So there seems to be a lot of rhetorics, but not so much real operations on the ground. I mean, just to take one of the what does not work sides. But then on the positive side, then to close, just to say that on the other hand, there is a remarkable tipping point in the recognition in the world that we are facing an interdisciplinary, much more challenging globalized future, that resilience is truly a core of our ability to navigate a turbulent future. You may have seen at the Resilience Day here in Bourget with even Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations launching its Global Resilience Initiative, and we're seeing the Global Resilience Partnership, we're seeing the CJR and the Waterland Ecosystem Program, which I also happen to chair, by the way, which is focusing increasingly on resilience as a landscape managing unit for ecosystem-based sustainable intensification of agriculture. So these are actually interactions that are occurring increasingly between stakeholders, but we're not seeing, you know, it really going to scale. And then just finally to share one initiative that works across stakeholders in an interesting new way, which is called the EAT initiative, which tries to link sustainable food systems with health, which is a very important step forward in recognizing the fact that basically what we eat determines the outcome for the sustainability of the planet, but what we eat determines the outcome for the health of human populations across the world, with diabetes 1 and antibiotic resistance and basically obesity and malnourishment being the most rapidly growing human diseases threatening humanity's well-being on this planet. And we're not seeing, believe it or not, stakeholders really working together between health, sustainability and food at scale, and the EAT initiative is really trying to do that between scientists, business leaders and policy. And believe it or not, the business leaders, I argue, are very, very engaged in this and really want to find solutions towards being able to answer more actively. I mean, companies like Unilever, like big, you know, from Walmart to large food industries across Europe and the States, but also initiatives in China and India and elsewhere, recognizing that a young generation will demand much more investments in sustainable, healthy food systems to be able to be competitive. So of course we have opportunities here, but I think still the dialogue today would be interesting to see how do we really get this to become truly operational at scale. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johan. And I think one thing that we'll have to come back to is you've mentioned several initiatives, including several that you're involved in. What's the collaboration between these? But we'll come back to that. So Sarah, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to talk today about one approach to addressing this cross-sectoral collaboration, which is integrated landscape management. And I have to give a plug for the new book that we launched yesterday on the Little Sustainable Landscape book, in which 12 different organizations at least were involved in trying to come up with a synthesis of what we really mean by that. But in a very simple way, it's about managing landscapes collaboratively with multiple stakeholders to achieve sustainable landscapes. And one of the things that's been quite interesting about this, because it's a movement that's happening globally over the last 20 years from multiple communities of practice, and really over the last few years we've seen an enormous amount of levels of endorsement by public agencies, by national governments and others of this approach. With, however, I would say the strongest support from it still coming from the environmental side. And what's particularly exciting in just the last few years has been the growing recognition of the importance of a landscape approach in achieving sustainable diets, in achieving good nutrition, in achieving food production, sustainable sources of food production. So I wanted to take just a moment to outline the 5 main ways in which thinking from a landscape approach gives us some new entry points and some new tools in terms of addressing food security and sustainable agriculture. The first one, of course, is thinking at a landscape scale about how land is being utilized for food and non-food products, and within food for high nutrition food versus other foods, for looking at ways of growing food with more nutrient-rich soils that generate more nutrient-rich foods. There's a whole series of things that's very exciting around how you actually manage the mainstream production agriculture part of the landscape. There's also been a big push around recognizing the relationship between agrobiodiversity and dietary diversity and the benefits that that can have for nutrition, particularly around micronutrients. So we're starting to have a lot of innovation about secondary crops, trying to do improvement of secondary crops, trying to build agroforestry systems where a main commercial crop is also associated with a number of bush and shrub and tree species that will also be good for foods. And so to me, it's one of the most exciting new areas of diversifying our food system, which is highly, highly at risk right now from an overdependence on just basically 3 major crops globally. The third aspect in the landscape to look at, which receives much less attention, and is primarily of local relevance, is the importance of wild foods and foods that are gathered from the wild but actually managed by communities for their value for food and other kinds of products that contribute to sustainable diets and nutrition. And this is species that are found in the understory of agricultural fields. They're species that are found in wetlands, species that are found in forests and in rangelands, and grossly under-recognized in the assessments of food, particularly for rural people, and of particular importance for low-income food insecure groups. And many of them manage it in a way that most people are not recognizing that they're actually doing. The fourth aspect is that if we look at whole landscapes, we can see that there's particular niches within the landscape that can be used for emergency food supplies. This is the kinds of crops that are stored in the ground for many months that can be available if there's a famine or a drought. It's looking at reserve grazing areas that can be managed at a landscape scale that requires collaboration across many groups. So there's a whole range of opportunities with home gardens for having multiple products that are micronutrient rich, that can be available during the pre-harvest hunger season, that are particularly important for low-income people. And of course, the fifth element of this, which again is under-recognized, and I think Johan underscored this, is that our food production systems inherently are dependent upon a stable ecosystem. For access to water, for pollinators, for the management of pest and disease controls. And those pest and disease control also include vectors not only for agricultural crops, but for livestock and for people. And so there's a very strong, this One Health idea of linking human health, livestock health, and ecosystem health is really quite critical in terms of this. Also, the management of whole landscapes to reduce flood risks, the management of whole landscapes to reduce drought risks, to look at managing microclimates. I think we're really recognizing that in an environment of much more high-risk climate conditions, facing producers and food consumers, that we need to think about the ecosystem as one of the tools that we manage for food production. So I think that's where I'll stop right now in terms of laying that out, and hopefully you'll give me a chance to talk a little bit about the exciting opportunities that people are actually doing to manage this.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. So, Patrick, I think this is the one that works. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you very much. An executive summary of what I'm about to say is that I do think it's possible to develop multifunctional food production systems which coexist with the getting ourselves inside Johann's planetary boundaries and feeding however many people it's going to be at the peak population. And but I think there are some major barriers. I think the best way to explore this is to tell my story. I'm a practitioner. I'm lucky enough to have occupied a piece of land in West Wales for 43 years and observed the consequences of my actions, which have been an attempt to farm as sustainably as possible on the outcomes. And one of the outcomes is I milked my cows yesterday before I came here. And the outcome is the milk that I milked from my cows yesterday is being made into cheese as we speak, but obviously not by me. But one of the exciting things about having put sustainable principles into practice over a long period of time, by which I mean minimizing my use of non-renewable external inputs. We've used no nitrogen fertilizer now for the whole time we've been on the farm, or synthetic pesticides, few antibiotics. We practiced crop rotation to build fertility, and we tried to obey the law of return with nutrient cycling as much as we're able to, is that after 5 crop rotations, 7 years or thereabouts on some of the land, it's very clear that the system can work. Our soil fertility would appear to be increasing. I regret to say we haven't monitored as well as we should have done, because we're not a research institute. We are simply a small family farm. But it's clear from yields, it's clear from the diversity and the abundance of nature, it's clear from the increasing health and resilience of the crop and the livestock that it is possible to do this and make it work in time. And for me, that's an incredibly encouraging message. However, here's the barriers bit. When we first started, we found pretty quickly that there wasn't a business case to farm as we were doing compared with our neighbours. So we had the bright idea of writing down the prescription of what we were doing, more or less on the back of an envelope at that time, and taking our story to the consumers, because we thought, well, if it costs more to produce food in this way, maybe the consumer will pay the difference. And that was one piece of the story of the development of the organic standards. I actually wrote the first draft of the dairy standards many years ago. This is in the 80s. And I then became quite involved in the UK and internationally with the development of the organic market, which has prospered. But I think it would be fair to say that, in a way, the whole organic market project was treating the symptoms, not the cause of the problem, or not one of the principal causes of the problem, which, namely, the failure to internalize the damaging negative externalities, as economists like to call them, arising from the system that we were competing against. Because we had to put all the price on the food that we were selling in the marketplace. That resulted in a significant premium, varies between different crops, obviously, but that confined the growth of the market to a kind of glass ceiling through which I think it will be unable to break until we grasp the nettle of some of the structural barriers to the uptake of sustainable agriculture on a bigger scale. And I will come back to that in a moment. I think that we are now on the edge of doing that, and despite what Johann said, don't you feel that the political wind is potentially shifting? I mean, we haven't got to agriculture yet properly, but could we get there quite soon now if our voices are raised on this? So I would say now that we need to better understand the nature, scale, and extent of the damaging consequences to the environment and public health of the current dominant system. And if we can get a handle on that and monetize it where we can, then we can go to politicians and say to them, look, if you want to rebuild soil carbon, you're going to have to deal with these problems of uncosted negative externalities in the present system, which are distorting the price of food and giving us what I would call a dishonest food market, where the prices don't reflect the real cost of production or the benefits delivered by the people who are trying to farm in a more sustainable way. So that comes to my issues. What do I think the key barriers are? Well, I think a lot of it turns, actually, I mentioned it, on nitrogen. Nitrogen fertilizer. I don't believe you can rebuild soil carbon on the predominantly arable farmed soils of the world unless you go back into crop rotation. And crop rotation increases soil organic matter and soil biology. But if you use nitrogen fertilizer, it's a biosuppressant, and then if you use nitrogen fertilizer, you'll almost certainly have to use pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides, and you won't probably grow grass, clover, legumes to rebuild the soil fertility, which you need in the first place. So I think we have to face the difficult challenge of weaning ourselves off our addiction to nitrogen, which really is the key problem with most of the world's mainly arable soils. I think that the economics of getting a handle on the economics is critical, and Julia asked me to mention TBAF, which is going to be launched, I think, in this room later this afternoon. A very important initiative indeed, because it's the first time that a group of researchers and people who are prominent in this field have agreed in a relatively well-funded and structured way to tackle this question of getting a handle on the scale and extent of negative and positive externalities and putting a price on them, and then armed with that information, going back and thinking about what policy instruments and other mechanisms we can bring into play to correct these economic distortions. Really important initiative. The last barrier, which I think is important, having just eaten a vegetarian lunch, is linking sustainable diets to the productive capacity of truly sustainable agriculture. We really need to work out what sustainable food systems look like in terms of what they produce. And certainly in the case of much of the temperate world, livestock, particularly ruminants, particularly grass-fed ruminants, I believe are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And sadly, in this debate about climate change, the grass-fed ruminant baby has been thrown out with the bathwater of the grain-fed concentrated animal feeding operation, beef animal. And we really need to think about how, for instance, in the UK, we're 70% grassland. What are we going to do with that grassland in a sustainable world? And apparently, tallow, beef fat, is incinerated in unimaginable quantities whilst we're producing palm oil in a devastating way in Indonesia. So we really have to have a better think about what a sustainable diet looks like, linked to the productive capacity of sustainable agriculture in different parts of the world.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. But you did have a vegetarian lunch.
I enjoyed it.
Okay, good. Okay, very good. So, Johan, I think indeed the key barriers that you mentioned, nitrogen and so on. But one of the biggest key barriers is the way we think and the way we think we're going to have to live in this new world. Johan, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago for Davos, we jointly did an op-ed, and I know you use this expression that we decided on together, and I do too in speeches, that growth doesn't have to be seen as something very sad, and we're not going to be going back to the dark ages, but it is growth within limits, but it is growth. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. And also I'd like to ask you again about the connections. There are many, many people, now that I'm more of a private citizen than I was before, I have been in many sessions this week. And many people are saying, why are all these acronyms? Why are there 17 goals? I mean, frankly, you know, when I heard you, Sarah, I have to confess that at IUCN, we initially thought there should only be one goal, and it should be about the healthy planet, healthy biodiversity. At the end, there are 17 goals. We've got to make sure that they're connected. So how are all these things that you're involved in, the EAT initiative, the planetary boundaries, the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, an impossible acronym, but biodiversity is a part of that, of course. How are they all linked together to give us this wonderful new future of growth within limits, though?
Thanks, Julia. Let me just start with Patrick's very important point. I agree with you. There is a new wind blowing politically. So my key point is this awkward situation we're in. I mean, I think many of us have been rightly being concerned over the past decade that the political leadership in the world has actually been lagging behind both civil society, practitioners, and scientists. And then suddenly we see in 2015 how the political leadership in the world is actually coming back in a very forceful way, successfully adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, which rightly, as you point out, Julia, is a real transition into a completely new logic for people and planet, and carefully optimistic also we come through something here in Paris. So there's a new wind blowing politically in the world, but it's not translating yet into a recognition among those who are really funding research, funding development, really doing the kind of applied world reality to get things to scale. I mean, we don't see initiatives to get sustainable intensification of agriculture to scale, which is necessary to meet the SDGs. So there's a mismatch there. That was my only point, really. And then on limits, well, this is quite a significant evolution that we've seen through that. I mean, we live in a world that has, since the Industrial Revolution, built itself on the idea that we can have growth without limits. Basically, that the planet is so large that we can, even if we understand unsustainable land use or deforestation or emission of greenhouse gases or freshwater overuse or nitrogen leaching, that, you know, the planet simply can take this abuse and there's no cost involved. It's a kind of a subsidy, or it is a subsidy to a GDP-based assumption of growth without limits. And science and civil society has very clearly, since the 1950s, made it clear that we have limits to growth, that there's been a growing dichotomy between the stance that humanity is actually breaching many of the life support systems on Earth correctly, but actually framing it as a limits to growth argument, which has created a dichotomy, which you all are familiar with, which is still here as if there was some kind of contradiction between sustainability and development. And of course, we all know that there is no such contradiction. It's very healthy to see how many stakeholders across the world is now recognizing a transition towards growth within limits, to recognize that there's no contradiction between hard sustainability within a carbon budget or biodiversity halting or planetary boundaries in general, and innovation, transformation towards prosperous futures. That we can, as Patrick points out, we can have good food production, healthy food production, while still remaining within a safe operating space on the biosphere in the climate system. And that this requires innovation, transformation, and behavioral change. And that this is a very, very exciting, potentially the most significant transition in our mental model and where we put our efforts in the future. And that has a lot of scientific support, but it does have dramatic transformative change. I mean, as Patrick points out, for example, the planetary boundary science concludes that we are transgressing our nitrogen boundary in the world so seriously that we have to reduce our transformation of in reactive N2 from the atmosphere to reactive nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process with 75%. So we all have to basically do as you're doing. And that's a very dramatic transition to avoid eutrophication, greenhouse gas emissions, and reduction of ecosystem functioning. So that's absolutely clear. Now, when it comes to the collaboration and links between initiatives like the CGIR, which we call the CIGAR to keep it simple sometimes, but the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, which for those of you not familiar with, is the largest international agricultural research network for innovation and development, particularly in developing countries, with initiatives such as the EAT initiative and with sustainability science, is growing, I would say, and it's growing between groups of scientists, many are here in the room, trying to connect the evidence around ecosystem services and resilience supporting development towards a more sustainable intensified agriculture as a way of using landscapes as a vehicle for success. We also have the EAT initiative collaborating with the Carasso Foundation and the new panel on sustainability and agricultural development, which are really important initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives to get science, business, and policy to work together towards finding these successful avenues. So it's, of course, there are very many things happening. The key is to get it to scale.
Exactly. Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Actually, Patrick, I was going to ask you about scale. Whether you think, what's your advice to scaling up the kinds of things that you do? You said very modestly you have a small farm, but it's got to be scaled up.
Yeah, and it is a huge challenge. And just to the point that Johan's just made about, if it's true that we all do have to wean ourselves off nitrogen, that will mean the biggest change in farm production systems with enormous implications for literally redesigning our systems from the ground up globally, that it's almost possible to imagine, certainly in recent history. And I think, you know, it's difficult for politicians to get a handle on that. It's also difficult for food businesses, because at the moment the best business case, if you're a large food company, is to produce food in a way which is damaging to the environment and public health. And I saw this amazing chart in Milan at a meeting organized by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, put on by a Nestle sustainability advisor, who looked at the profits of all the sectoral companies in the world, mining and agriculture, food, everything. And then they top sliced off the profits what would happen if you deducted the negative externalities. And everybody thought it was going to be fossil fuels was going to be the worst. But no, it was food. If you deducted the externalities of the profits of the world's biggest food companies, the Unilevers of this world, and they're of course the most enlightened food company, it put them into the red. So no wonder these food companies are reluctant to make the change, because it's going to hurt their bottom line. You can't blame them for that, but we've got to devise a system whereby it becomes a better business case to do the right thing. And that, I think, is the challenge, because I think the food systems that we need for the future are scalable. In my opinion, what a smallholder farmer in Africa has to do is not that dissimilar from what I'm doing in my very wet, currently, Welsh Hill, or can be done on a very large estate somewhere else in North America, in the Midwest, for instance, which is corn soy at the moment. But the changes, there need to be a business case for the changes that the farmer or the food company needs to make, and at the moment there isn't one. So we really need to think about the economic and policy instruments which will give rise to that better business case. Otherwise you get people like the Obamas and the Camerons in my country privately agreeing with this stuff but never speaking about it publicly, because it looks like elitism and it'll put the price of food up. So we've got a really major structural barrier here.
Thank you very much. Great. Okay, Sarah. So what does your Landscape for People, Food and Nature initiative, how can it contribute to all of these issues?
Okay.
It's got the perfect title already.
I'm glad that you like the title. That's great. Well, first of all, the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature initiative is a coalition of about 70 organizations worldwide, from the agriculture sector, the conservation sector, the rural development, more recently the urban development sector, trying to come together to look at how do we manage whole landscapes for the full range of things we want from our landscapes. Basically, we've had the last 100 years where both at the public, private sector, the financial sector, the training and the research were all done in this extremely siloed way that Johan was referring to, and not looking at collaborating together. But people on the ground are actually facing issues where, for example, the farmers can't move forward unless they can collaborate with the conservation organizations. So there have been, and we think we've counted, how many were there the last time? I mean, 70-something different communities of practice that are doing integrated landscape management in one form or the other. And one of the major activities of the Landscape for People, Food and Nature, which it works through a series of working groups that focus on finance, on landscape management, on capacity building, on research, on communications, et cetera. But one of the big activities that we did were a series of continental reviews. And these were led by eco-agriculture partners with Cartier, who I see here, Bioversity, who I see here, ICRAF, with the Water, Land and Ecosystem Services, and in Europe with a study that's not quite published yet with the European Union's Hercules project. But we went around to see, where are these integrated landscape management initiatives that people talk about? Where are there initiatives that are at scale, that are operational, that explicitly seek agricultural objectives, livelihood objectives, and environmental objectives? Now, and we actually came up with, in the developing world, we've done Africa, we've done Latin America and the Caribbean, we've done South and Southeast Asia, and as I said, Europe is just finishing, and we're hoping to finish the rest of them up in the next year or two. But in the developing world, there were 365 initiatives that we managed to document. Many more that we found but just couldn't get documentation on. And I wanted to just read a couple of statistics to tell you, we started out not paying attention much to nutrition and health in this, and it wasn't a criteria for identifying the landscape initiatives. But one of the things that this study found is that almost 16% of them had improved health as one of their top motivating forces, if not the top motivating forces. And 73% of these initiatives included health and nutrition among their motivating factors for these initiatives. This was actually kind of a surprise to us. We clearly had not been sufficiently engaging the nutrition and health sectors in our own work. What was also quite interesting about this is that 19% of these initiatives explicitly had stakeholder groups that were from the health sector. And it was almost 29% of them included programs explicitly for reducing malnutrition. And if you then looked at the ones that were reporting where had they had their most significant impacts of these multi-stakeholder collaborative programs across large landscapes, 23.5% of them reported major improvements in health. 57% reported major improvements in food security and nutrition, and 32.2% noted major improvements in access to health. This is the kind of thing that we think there's this huge potential to build on synergies by working across. If it's just the farmers, you need allies. And what this does is it brings allies. People redesign their sectoral investment programs in ways that include something on nutrition. And I think, I found this really very fascinating. We obviously need, better metrics from all of these places. But I think we have not been considering how we can integrate our objectives. We have many cases now, in the developing world particularly, where these are win-win situations. Certainly there's people in the room here who've been doing research on agroforestry and a number of things where actually returns to farmers and productivity dramatically increase by using more sustainable practices. And I think, as Johan said, we're dramatically underinvesting in the research program. So I wanted to bring us back for a minute to, Julia, your point about the Sustainable Development Goals. I talked to many of my friends who work in sustainable agriculture and food security, and they're all excited about how we're all gonna organize and mobilize now around the goal on food security and sustainable agriculture. And my response to them is absolutely, we absolutely need to do that. And we need to get food security, nutrition, and sustainable diets into just about every other. We actually have identified 12 of the 17 goals in which there's a clear role for changing the way we do agriculture to help meet that goal and changing the way we systematically do those activities to incorporate agriculture. I'll close with just one very fascinating finding from the Global Environment Facility, which recently did a review of their major sort of investments in landscape management for biodiversity, land degradation, et cetera. They found the biggest impacts, positive impacts on food security from their biodiversity projects, because they have begun to redesign their biodiversity projects to bring in other partners. So I think we're not only in having a new world where we need to think differently, this is not necessarily negative. I think there's some very unrealized potentials, and this integrated landscape management approach, where you're actually dealing with at the level at which actors actually function, are in fact way ahead of our major institutions of research, governance, and education.
Great, thank you very much. I really dislike having such a short session for such an important topic. But I'm going to throw out two questions, and each of you can choose to answer one or both, but very quickly, and then I'd love to go back to the audience. First of all, how could national policies better align food production to health and sustainability goals? What's your experience? You said that our two big countries' leaders believe it, but they think it's politically incorrect to talk about it. And then the other thing is about the consumer. How do the consumers know that the food choices they make come from sustainably produced systems? I have to say, I now live in Paris, and my local supermarket in the last couple of weeks has a much bigger section which has what they call here bio food, but it just happened sort of overnight. So either of those questions are both very quickly. Johan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so let me then, in a way, connect a bit with Patrick, with whom I agree a lot. But there's one thing that I find, in a way, is in disagreement, which aligns with your question, which is as follows. I think the most important national policy, but also which comes down to the consumer when it comes to transition to sustainable food consumption, has to break with this old concept, which you kind of referred rightly to, which is this assumption that we as consumers and also in national policy are assumed to be willing to pay more for sustainable food or sustainable diets, and that we're so to say willing to put that extra purchasing power, and moreover often even expected to have some key level of understanding. I think it's completely the reverse, that we have to recognize that if we're going to get a transition towards a sustainable future in the world, we need to get the large indifferent majority, which happens to be at least 80% of the population in any society, to basically make the right choice automatically. And therefore, doing the right choice has to become the cheapest choice. And the only way to make the sustainable food choice the cheapest choice is through national policies that put taxes, costs, prices, real hard policy measures on unsustainable food items. And that this is, we're simply expecting a little bit too much generally of consumers to be able to come into a store and read, you know, this is my sustainable here, sustainable there, it's carbon, it's biodiversity, it's equity, etc. And this is simply important, clearly important, but it never penetrates more than 10-15% of any market share. So if we're going to make it real into a sustainable transition of nations, the world as a whole, we simply have to make it the easy slide towards indifference. And it's bizarre that indifference, which sounds so boring, would be our best friend, but I think that is really the key issue here.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm not sure we do disagree, although how are we going to deal with the problem of food which is artificially too cheap, like chicken, for instance? Because I wasn't suggesting that sustainable food should cost more. I think I agree with you, it should cost less, but I can't see how those indifferent people are going to stop buying chicken unless you make it a more pricey item in their food basket. And that would mean to put a tax on the damage that intensive livestock production, grain-fed livestock production causes, which would have the effect of putting up that kind of food. So how could you do it if you didn't do that? And that's what's politically difficult for the Obamas and the Camerons of this world, because it would probably, at the moment, we actually have negative price inflation in the UK. The main reason is an unbelievable cutthroat war in the supermarkets, which is making food ever cheaper, which isn't really cheap at all, as we both know.
So Sarah, every time you live in the United States, right? Every time I go to the U.S. and I order food in a restaurant, I get terribly depressed at the size of the portion. So how are you helping to influence national policy in the country where you live?
Okay, we are not doing a lot in the United States, although we have many partners that are doing quite a lot in the United States. And I would say that in terms of integrated landscape management, there's an extraordinary amount of work going on in the United States at the grassroots level that's not yet reaching our policy level, including some of the most conservative states. So I'm waiting to see politically how that can be translated into political action. But I think we're not as far off as some of us some depressing days think they are. But I did want to say a little bit more about where I have been working more, which is in Africa. Some of you this morning may have gone to the launch of the African Resilient Landscape Initiative. And this is, I would say that in general, Africa is far ahead of many of the other parts of the world, partly because they're recognizing their extreme vulnerability to climate change. They're facing extreme vulnerabilities around water. It's just simply no longer acceptable to say you're going to double food production in a way that's going to mess up the watershed. That is just not politically acceptable in many countries. So I think you're starting to see some very significant leaderships from countries like Ethiopia that has a national program, and that they have a comprehensive, what is it, a 10 or 15, 20-year program in which these multiple objectives are explicitly laid out. 10 countries have already signed on to this African Resilient Landscape Initiative. So I think we are starting to see some real changes. We're also seeing some amazing changes at the city region level. You can go to Calgary in Canada. You can go to a number of cities in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, where they've gone beyond just thinking about food problems in cities as how do we get the food right there, but they're looking at their relationship with the whole region that is their food shed, that is their watershed, that is their source of recreation and culture for the cities as a whole. So I actually see an enormous amount of innovation. It just hasn't, it hasn't hit. And I think I would want to add, I actually totally agree. I'm an economist by training, so I definitely think it would be the most desirable for us to get rid of our subsidies. But living in a country that can't even do a carbon tax, okay, even though there's all sorts of good benefits from it, I think there is a companion approach to it that I think is reflected in these large landscape initiatives. Because what you're presenting then is you producers who are producing coffee in the Vietnamese highlands, if you changed your coffee production systems, your neighbors who need to drink that water, your neighbors, the fisher people in your area that rely on fish that were grown in that water, will be benefited. And you can get kudos from them. And you can get collaborative agreements at the jurisdictional level, at the state level, or through bylaws systems at the landscape levels where those don't correspond to administrative districts, where you see in face-to-face the groups that will benefit from a shift, and you see face-to-face the groups that are suffering because of that. Now, that doesn't deal with the consumer side of things, although there's some very interesting work that's going on right now about landscape labeling. It's still in its infancy, but I think it has a lot of traction. But you also have whole jurisdictions that are making, I learned today about Sikkim in Africa, in India, that is just made in a fully organic country. So I actually think let's experiment at this lower level, which is going to come up with models that will give us a clear direction for our national programs.
So you've just proved to me why I really think we need to change our vocabulary about developing and developed countries. You really had, we've got to get rid of that vocabulary. Patrick, you wanted to say one word, and then I'm going to let people ask questions.
My suggested politically possible government intervention would be for all the leaders to get behind paying farmers to be soil carbon stewards, because that's so related to locking up CO2 in the soil. It could be adopted by, it could be a leading and inspirational thing, and if you could link the soil carbon outcomes of different farming systems to a payment, which could either be redirected subsidies or the tax on nitrogen, which is recycled, I think that would have traction, because it would be seen to be farmers addressing climate change.
We just need to move toward a new economic model, absolutely. We have very little time. Just comments or questions, very short, please. 1, 2. Do we have working? Okay, I think so. Yeah. And then this lady. Yeah. Just say who you are very quickly.
Patrick Binns, Westbrook Associates, Seattle, Washington, USA. I'd like to draw attention to science connections. Many of the speakers have talked about CGIAR. What I would like to say is that when you look at CGIAR's fundamental programs, they focus on 6, maybe 12 commodity crops. When we look at the biodiversity of sustainability, food, nutrition, and so forth, what you don't see is there's not a research program on livestock fodder. There's not a research program on rangeland grasses. Fundamentally, there's no program on the biodiversity of beneficial soil biota, which really drives soil health and plant growth and resilience to disease. So I think we're at a very pivotal point, because when I'm looking at CGIAR, and they've done a lot of good work, but they're in a mode of reforming what their objectives are. But when I look at the strategic framework that they've come up with and the programs that are being proposed, it pretty much looks like the same thing that we've had for the last several decades. And I think that we really ought to take the chance at this gathering to let people know that if CGIAR is supposed to be supported with government funding and donor funding, we better get them to broaden their programs to address biodiverse programs like fodder, grass, and beneficial soil biota. I really think it's absolutely critical, and I'd be interested in comments on that.
Very, very helpful comment. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
I would like to direct my question to Patrick, which is, even excluding externalities, why is sustainable farming so much more expensive than conventional farming? We're not using, with sustainable farming, we're not using nitrogen, we're not using pesticides, we're not tilling. Why is sustainable farming more expensive?
It's not really more expensive. It has the, appearance of being more expensive because the other form of farming is mining natural capital, treating it as if it was income, causing vast damage to public health and trashing the ecosystems of the planet and not being charged for it. So I don't think it's fair to
I agree,
make
but
the
I'm saying
comparison.
even excluding those externalities, just the simple act of farming.
I mean, Pavan was sitting up here before lunch and he was reminding us that the smallholder farmers employ how many billion people is it? And a job working on the land is a positive externality, and yet it's treated by industrial agriculture as a negative externality because it's a cost. So we need to restructure the whole economics of the future of farming. I think it's possible, if you farm really well and sustainably, to come quite close to the profitability of conventional farming, at least with some crops. But it's hard, and I think unless we remove some of these barriers, we're never going to become mainstream, because this is really a theory of change conversation we're having, is it not, Johan? I mean, it's about, we're not disagreeing, we're just working out what the levers are that would unleash things.
Very good. We're going to have to move ahead in the theory of change. Okay. I think that there were two people there. Yes. David and...
Yes, Professor Mauro Agnoletti. I'm head of the landscape department of the University of Florence, but I'm here as chair of the Commission for Landscape of the Italian Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Forestry. So my question is that in my job, at least, where we make laws and we put a lot of money in rural development according to the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, we see something that is going to create a kind of conflict. And I want to ask this question to Mr. Olden. And we are abandoning a lot of land, not only in Italy, but also in Europe. Our rate of abandonment is 100,000 hectares every year. We've been growing our forest in the past by 6 million hectares. So we are importing food from abroad. And if we want to turn from an industrialized agriculture to lower external inputs agriculture, in our view, we need to cultivate more land. Less input, less energy, more land. So the problem that we are encountering is when we say that we present that simple issue of removing the forest that has been growing on our abandoned land, if we want to cultivate more, especially in a sustainable way, because it means to produce less per hectare, so you need more land. So this is something that in our government is creating a lot of troubles, because of course you can perfectly understand in the current situation of climate change policy, carbon sink, playing forest. And the last question is very simple. Have you heard about the CBD UNESCO Declaration on Biocultural Diversity, which was presented at the high-level segment meeting in COP12 in Korea and recently by UNESCO? Because this has been developed with the thinking for the things we are discussing here. Sorry.
Yeah. So David Cooper, CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. Just wanted to pick up on something Johan alluded to at the beginning, which was the ill health effects of many of our diets. Current dietary trends will not only increase the footprint, the carbon footprint, and lead to more land use change, more biodiversity loss. It will also make us all increasingly unhealthy through heart disease, diabetes, and so on. As Johan mentioned, major increases in non-communicable diseases. So how can we combine the health agenda with the sustainability agenda? I'll just plug a state of knowledge review on the linkages between biodiversity and human health that the CB did jointly with WHO. You can find it on the WHO website or the CBD website, looking into some of these interlinkages. But how can we build upon that? Perhaps build also on the experience of public health campaigns, for example, anti-smoking campaigns, and now campaigns towards reducing sugar and so on, to get this win-win between health and biodiversity and actually climate win as well. If we don't moderate this increased consumption, we're not going to be able to square the circle of meeting all these different agendas. If we do, though, we certainly can.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have one more burning question? Go ahead.
No, right here.
Oh, okay,
microphone.
one there, one here, and then we're going to have to let...
I'll make it quick. Hello, my name is Jeffrey Caston. I am the Manager of Development and Design with Restoration Agriculture Development, coming from New Forest Farm in southwest Wisconsin, home of the world's largest farmer-owned aggregations, home of the world's largest organic farmer-owned cooperative. My question is, I work with a lot of agroforestry consultants, or I am an agroforestry consultant. I work with a lot of farmers throughout the United States and elsewhere. And one of the major issues we're running into in the American Southwest, of course, is the water issue. And it's happening around the world. So we've been engaging with farmers as to how can we create an alliance between cities and also farms, because the farms are actually capturing the rainwater, and I think they should be incentivized to actually harvest the rainwater in addition to establishing the agroforestry system. So how can farmers be incentivized to install rainwater harvesting? That's my question.
One more question.
Thank you very much. My name is Elko Leemans, and I'm involved in several initiatives on the marine environment. So I was looking at the title of this topic, in this landscapes and seascapes, and of course the interesting thing is that most of the majority of the wild food we're catching is out at sea. But there's also a lot of loss. There's for instance, the principle of high grading, where a fishing boat, a fishing trawler will catch some fish, and then later, while they're processing they find out that it's not the best fish they can have, and they go for a new catch, and they throw overboard all the fish they caught before. The other thing is, of course, finning of sharks, where they only use the shark fins. And this is something that is very difficult to regulate on a national level. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this? But this could be a topic for a whole new conference.
Yeah, well, thank heavens there is an awful lot more discussion about that. Very important. Very quickly from each of you, and then we're going to have to stop. Sarah, go ahead.
I wanted to actually address the comment particularly about this potential theoretical trade-off between increasing food production and reducing nature. We've done comparative research around the world, and there are some very specific conditions of low population density and high incomes that are associated with the trade-off you're discussing, and also with particular kinds of production systems that are based on monoculture annual crop systems, that if you, and that are very high yield and very mining of resources, where you do get the outcome that if you if you try to increase sustainability, it means a yield reduction and it means an expansion. It's a very small minority of countries where that has ever been documented. In the vast majority of countries, and particularly in most of the developing world, you have some exceptions in the high tropical forest areas where it's been driven very heavily by large-scale commercial enterprises, where it's policy decision to spread into the forest. You have some others where there's the smallholder, but in the vast majority of the developing world and most of the densely populated developed world, you actually have you have an opportunity to double, in much of Africa you can double or triple agricultural production in ways that will benefit forest cover in the mosaic, that will benefit soils, will benefit climate. So I think we should be really careful about recognizing that in most cases, increasing agricultural sustainability should be a win-win situation. If it's not, it's because it's badly designed.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
I think the land sharing, land sparing issue is something which really needs future attention, because I think the argument for the dominant people in policy circles at the moment is that you further intensify on the best land in order to spare the land which is going to be given to nature. This is an old, failed way of thinking, and I think we need a new way of thinking, which is integrating nature, sustainable food production with coexistence with nature, and that really is, needs to be dealt with in terms of that question. The health issue, I think we do need to follow the money, and we're organising a conference on the true cost of American food is the theme in San Francisco next April, at which we're going to talk to the health insurance and hospital people, the Kaiser Permanentes of this world, because they are picking up the bill for the consequences of industrial agriculture, and there's a lot of money involved. So I think following the money is part of the solution for that. The city issue, I mean, we need to develop new ways of connecting cities and That's the food plan argument. And the marine point is, I think it's a shame that this didn't come up in this, but in a way, future food production is about ecosystems management, and whether it's a wild harvesting predominantly ecosystem or an agricultural ecosystem, there needs to be convergence.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
The true cost of American food, and it's
in San Francisco, April.
My organization is called the Sustainable Food Trust. There'll be information about it.
So, Johan, last word, and then.
So super brief. Just to say also on the CJR comment, Patrick, I agree with you. There has been and are efforts of more integrated approaches. The Waterland Ecosystem Program is such an initiative, but it requires more investment and more priority from the CJR system because, and this is the big mismatch, because the world is demanding a transformation towards sustainable agriculture in the world, while the CJR is not fully recognizing that this is actually the ask. And that is something that will be recognized very soon. On Italy, I would say that my personal assessment, coming actually from Sweden, who has a similar situation in Italy, is that soon we'll find a reverse trend. We'll find a situation where actually we have to cultivate the existing land that we've been abandoning because of the challenge of meeting the dietary requirements in a rapidly growing population, not only in numbers, but in wealth as well. I mean, all assessments show that we need basically a new agricultural revolution, and it has to stay within planetary boundaries, which means zero expansion of agricultural land, which actually means that Italy and then Sweden and other countries will have a lot to contribute with. So I think that's a key priority. On water harvesting, I think that has to be taken on different realities, socio-economically and hydrologically around the world. But clearly, for the majority of people in the world facing massive challenges of untapped potentials of increasing food production because they have dry spells and variability of rainfall, which is so dramatic, government-initiated investments in innovation and basically learning about implementing water harvesting systems, I believe, is absolutely necessary. It's part of building more resilient farming systems in the future. And I totally agree on the marine side. In fact, as we all know, wild catches of fish in the world are not increasing. It's aquaculture, which is the largest increase in fish-based nutrition. But we also know that there's no way at all that this world will be able to eradicate hunger in this world by 2030 in a sustainable way on land without adding nutrition and proteins from the ocean. So the ocean has to be part of a solution here, and that integration is absolutely critical.
So many more things to talk about. Thank you all. I hope you've seen the connections between all these things. I hope you've signed the list, which will give us a chance to continue these conversations. And please help me thank the panelists.